Your AI scribe just finished documenting that visit in 30 seconds. Fast, clean, consistent. But here is the question your compliance officer needs you to answer before your next payer audit. If that note gets pulled, can you prove a human reviewed it, validated it, and that every clinical detail in it actually happened? Because right now, in 2026, that is exactly what auditors are asking, and AI-generated SOAP notes are increasingly the ones they are finding problems with. Let's start with what actually triggers an audit. The three most common red flags in AI-generated documentation are copy-forward content, cloned notes, and missing medical necessity. Copy-forward happens when an AI pulls language from a prior visit and reuses it in today's note. Sometimes because the system is designed that way, sometimes because the provider didn't catch it. Cloned notes look identical across multiple patient encounters. Same phrasing, same structure, same level of detail regardless of what actually happened in the room. And missing medical necessity means the note documents what was done, but does not clearly explain why it was clinically necessary for this specific patient on this specific date. All three are audit triggers. All three are more common in AI-generated notes than in manually written ones. The second risk area is specific to how AI systems generate content. When an AI scribe mishears something, misinterprets clinical context, or fills a gap with statistically likely language rather than what was actually said, that is a hallucination. In a SOAP note, a hallucinated symptom, a fabricated medication change, or an assumed diagnosis that the provider never documented is not just an inaccuracy. It is a false medical record. And if that note is used to support a billing code, it becomes a compliance liability. Inconsistent documentation is a related risk. When AI generates notes that vary in detail, depth, or structure across visits for the same patient, it creates patterns that look suspicious to automated payer review systems, which, in 2026, are themselves AI-powered and specifically trained to detect exactly these inconsistencies. Here is what defensible AI-generated documentation actually requires from a compliance standpoint. First, an audit trail. Every note needs a time-stamped record of when it was created, by which system, who reviewed it, and what changes were made before it was finalized. If an auditor pulls a note and asks when the provider reviewed it and what they changed, you need to be able to answer that precisely. Second, version control. The original AI-generated draft and the final provider-approved note should be distinguishable and separately preserved. If the only version on record is the final note with no documentation of the AI's role and the provider's review, you have an audit trail gap. Third, your documentation needs to consistently demonstrate medical necessity. Not just state the diagnosis and procedure, but connect them with the clinical reasoning that justifies the service and its billing level. The single most important protection against audit risk in AI-generated documentation is human validation, and not a checkbox at the end. Providers need to review the AI's transcription before the SOAP note is generated, not just review the finished note. Because if the transcription has an error and the provider only sees the polished output, they may approve a note that contains information they never actually said. Meaningful human review means reading the note against the clinical reality of the visit, not just signing off on formatting. Payers and auditors in 2026 are specifically looking for evidence that providers are engaging with AI-generated content rather than simply approving it in bulk. What makes documentation defensible under legal or regulatory scrutiny is not whether AI or a human generated it. It is whether it accurately reflects what happened, is supported by the clinical record, and can be traced back to a provider who reviewed and validated it. Defensible documentation standards for AI-generated notes in 2026 mean specificity over speed. Every note should capture patient-specific detail, not template language. Clinical reasoning documented, not just the what, but the why. Provider attestation with a clear timestamp, and zero tolerance for copy forward without explicit review. These are not just compliance best practices. They are the difference between a note that survives audit and one that creates a liability. AI-generated SOAP notes are not inherently a compliance risk, but AI-generated SOAP notes without proper audit trails, human validation, and defensible documentation standards are exactly the kind of records that draw regulatory attention in in 2026. If you want to understand how to structure AI-assisted documentation so it supports your billing and survives scrutiny, visit talismansolutions.com.